Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. I'm back with another Question the Narrative video, and today's topic is, was Jesus a Nephilim? Yeah, it's not a topic that I ever thought that I would approach on this channel, but I actually got the idea from this comment that I received yesterday. It says, question, how do we know anything we've been told about the Nephilim is true? Weren't they known as the men of renown, like Samson? In the New Testament, Jesus, who was born unto Mary, is described as both a son of God and a son of man. The definition of a Nephilim is the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. So isn't it possible that Jesus could be one of them? It seems like a lot of people are confusing the Nephilim with the fallen angels. Furthermore, if it's true that God Almighty wanted them washed from the face of the earth, how and why were they allowed then to survive the flood? I know, I ask a lot of questions. They're actually very good questions. And to be quite honest, a lot of them are questions that I've never thought about. So I'm happy to at least try to answer some of them. So, as to the question, how do we know anything we've been told about the Nephilim is true? And weren't they known as the men of renown like Samson? Let's start with that question. So, to answer that question, let's go to Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So from this passage here, what we can gather is that the Nephilim were the offspring of the sons of God, also known as the Watchers in the book of Enoch, and the daughters of men. Let's go to the book of Numbers, which tells us a little bit more about the Nephilim, because this is actually after the flood. Yes, this is Numbers 13:33. It tells us, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Let's actually go over here and read the context of this, because these sons of Anak, these Nephilim, they were not good guys. And so let's just read here. So they gave the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had spied out. The land we explored devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are great in stature. We even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak that come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we must have seemed the same to them. So if you read on about the sons of Anak, the Anakim, again, not good people, if you want to call them people, not good people. So if there were any book at all that I would say is trustworthy, the Bible is certainly trustworthy. We also have the book of Enoch, which is not considered canon, but is an extra biblical text. And that tells us exactly who and what the Nephilim were and how their behavior was. In addition to that, we also have the book of Giants. Now, I know that it can be confusing because the Nephilim in Hebrew, they are actually called demigods in many of the other cultures. So, Greek and Roman mythology, you have demigods. In Egyptian mythology, you have demigods. In Norse mythology, you have demigods. And very often, you're taught that these were heroes. These, let's just say, half divine, half human people. So, here we have Perseus, and he's looked at as a hero. Achilles is looked at as a hero. Hercules is looked at as a hero. And very often the term hero and men of renown is used interchangeably. But the difference is that the word hero is generally spoken of a good person, a good demigod. And on the contrary, men of renown can be either or. They can be good or they can be evil. And in fact, not all of the demigods even were good. So we have Procrustes, and he was the demigod son of Poseidon, and his mother was Silea, the daughter of Corinth. And he was a rogue smith and bandit from Attica who attacked people by stretching them or cutting off their legs so as to force them to fit the size of an iron bed. Another example of someone who would be considered one of the men of renown would be Minos. And he was also a demigod. He was the son of Zeus and Europa. And every 9 years, he made King Aegeus pick 7 young boys and 7 young girls to be sent to Daedalus's creation, the labyrinth, to be eaten by the Minotaur. And then after his death, King Minos became a judge of the dead in the underworld. So again, not really someone that you would look at as being a positive creature. So to think that just because they're called men of renown, that they would necessarily be good, I think is something that would not be the case. Even if you look at noble bloodlines from around the world, or royalty from around the world, whether it would be including Greece, Rome, Egyptian mythology, their rulers were tyrants. They were cruel, and they were very, very often demigods. So yeah, I think that the term men of renown can actually be very misleading, because again, it doesn't simply mean that something that's good. So the next question was, in the New Testament, Jesus, who was born unto Mary, is described as both a son of God and a son of man. The definition of a Nephilim is the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. So isn't it possible that Jesus could be one of them? If you look at it on the surface, then some people could get that idea. But I am going to give a very emphatic no to that. In the book Reversing Hermon by Dr. Michael Heiser, he tells us, in the birth narrative, Matthew shows the birth of Jesus occurring in a way that reverses the watcher's transgression and evil in the world as it occurs in the Enochic template. Specifically, the birth of Jesus occurs through the union of a woman and a celestial being. But in contrast to the watcher's story, no sexual relations are involved. So that's the first difference. There is no copulation involved in this. Further, in Matthew's narrative, the first humans outside of Jesus' immediate family to interact with the child Jesus are the Magi, who are practitioners of the illicit arts taught by the Watchers and use astrological knowledge to find Jesus. In the Enochic template, the Watchers bring idolatry into the world. In Matthew, the Magi worship the appropriate object of worship, Jesus. Now, before I even continue on this, I do want to point out to you that the book by Dr. Michael Heiser that I just read from, Reversing Hermon, I highly recommend it because it tells you specifically why Jesus had to be born through a human woman, and much of it does have to do with the transgression of the Watchers. So besides the fact that there was no copulation involved, another huge one, in my opinion, is the fact that Jesus already existed before he became incarnate. John 1:1 tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Who is the Word? The Word is Jesus. And John 1:1 tells us that Jesus has been there since the beginning. He was with God and he was God. So unlike the Nephilim, whose, I'm going to say soul, if they even have one, I'm not sure, would have been created upon their, I don't know, their fertilization maybe, or upon their birth. They were not only first created then, whereas Jesus has always been, but there's even a question of whether those souls of the Nephilim should have even been in existence in the first place. So that is another huge difference. And even when you come to the whole idea of Jesus being the Son of God, and then in Genesis 6, it talks about the sons of God, and people try to conflate the two. They are two very, very different things. So the sons of God in Genesis 6 are created beings, they were created by God. Whereas Jesus, when he was born on this earth, he was known as God's one and only son, correct? And everyone says, well, he wasn't the only son because it says that there were sons of God in Genesis 6. But I actually learned this from Berean Bible Church when I was just watching a video yesterday. The the word only is a very, very poor translation of the word that is actually used. It says here Greek scholars later discovered that the second part of the word monogenes does not come from the Greek verb geneo, but rather from the noun genos, which means class or kind. So the term literally means one of a kind or unique, without connotation of created. I'm not sure what that says, but it doesn't matter. So instead of the word only, when we think of for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, instead of thinking only, think of one of a kind. Jesus was one of a kind. So when we say that Jesus was the Son of God, that's why we use the capital letter S when it comes to him. He was not a created being. He was not like the other sons of God. He was a unique Son of God. And remember, he had been in existence since before he was born as a human child. Okay, so the next one says, it seems like a lot of people are confusing the Nephilim with the fallen angels. Yes, that is true. That is something that I do hear a lot. People are calling the fallen angels the Nephilim, when in fact it is the offspring that are the Nephilim. And I know that there are some more popular YouTubers, authors that even do the same thing. They call the fallen angels the Nephilim. But we know, especially from the book of Enoch, that the Nephilim are the offspring, not the fallen angels themselves. So I'm going to agree with you on that people do get that confused. Lastly, it says, furthermore, if it's true that God Almighty wanted them washed from the face of the earth, how and why were they allowed then to survive the flood? I know I ask a lot of questions. It's, again, I love these questions. They're very interesting. So, how and why were they allowed then to survive the flood? There are many theories on how they may have survived the flood. I actually did do a video on this a while back, and some of the theories are that one of them may have made his way onto the ark. There are some Hebrew traditions that say that King Og of Bashan made his way onto the ark, and that is how the Nephilim bloodline continued through the flood. There are other theories that the flood was localized, and so not the entire earth was flooded, but that it was just that particular region. And you have to remember that when it comes to the Hebrew word for earth at that time, it could also just mean land. So that didn't necessarily mean the entire earth, at least according to some scholars. Some other ideas are that, there were some Nephilim who were ocean bound, and so they obviously would have survived the flood because they were already in the ocean. There is the idea of underground labyrinth of tunnels. We have a vast cave system under the earth, and we know that there are tunnels that are still there to this day. So they may have seeked refuge down there. Now, I know that sought refuge, seeked is not a word, sought refuge. So, a lot of people will say, oh, but if that would have been flooded too. Well, you have to remember that what are the quote elite building for themselves today? They have DUMBs. They have deep underground military bases. And what is the purpose of them? Well, that is so that if anything happens, they would be able to basically lock themselves down there and keep themselves safe. And you can bet that those things are watertight. And if they have the technology now to do these things, do you not think that the children of the sons of God would have had the technology to also keep themselves safe in that way? Another idea is portals. They likely would have known where there were portals, and they could have used them also to keep themselves protected from the flood. In the same book by Dr. Michael Heiser, it says, there are two alternatives for explaining the presence of giants after the flood who descended from the giant Nephilim. One, the flood of Genesis 6 to 8 was a regional, not global catastrophe. And two, the same kind of behavior described in Genesis 6, 1 through 4 happened again or continued to happen after the flood, producing other Nephilim from whom the giant clans descended. And so that is another idea. They may not have actually survived the flood, but there may have been another incursion of fallen angels who did the same thing with human women after the flood. There's certainly some evidence that this sort of thing was happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. Continuing on in this book, it says the first option, a localized flood, naturally depends on the coherence of the arguments in defense of a local flood, especially those arguments dealing with the wording in the biblical text that seems to suggest the deluge was worldwide. Many biblical scholars, scientists, and other researchers have marshaled the evidence in favor of this reading. For our purposes, this option would allow human survival somewhere in the regions known to the biblical authors, specifically the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Aegean Sea. The second option is a possibility deriving from Hebrew grammar. Genesis 6:4 tells us there were Nephilim on earth before the flood and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind. The when in the verse could be translated whenever, thereby suggesting a repetition of these pre-flood events after the flood. In other words, since Genesis 6:4 points forward to the later giant clans, the phrasing could suggest that other sons of God fathered more Nephilim after the flood. As a result, there would be no survival of original Nephilim, and so the post-flood dilemma would be resolved. A later appearance of other Nephilim occurred by the same means as before the flood. So if it is something that happened after the flood, if there were no survivors from the flood, but there was another incursion after the flood, then that would, render the next question, null and void, because we wouldn't need to know why were they allowed to survive if they actually didn't survive. But as to the possibility that some of them may have survived the flood, you know, I'm just going to tell you that I don't know the mind of God. It may have been his part of his plan of redemption, especially because we know that Jesus becoming incarnate through a human woman had a lot to do with the sin of the watchers as well. So we always think of it as just what happened in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, but it had just as much to do with the sin of the watchers. So could that have also been part of the plan? I don't know. That's just some speculation on my part, and probably the best answer that I have to this at this point in time. But anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or over on Instagram. And if you like my work and would like to check out my YouTube membership, I will leave a link in the description box for that, or you can just click on it on my channel page as well. And I hope you have a great day.